This is the FYI Youth Ministry, a podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute, and I'm Giovanny Panginda. This season, we focused on talking about race with teenagers and each other. And in this episode, we're addressing migration realities. For today's conversation, we have Kevin Wilson joining us. So listen on as Kevin, Roslyn, and I converse about our own migration stories and share practical ideas on how to honor your students and their families' immigration stories. But first, here's what young people said about this topic.
If you look at the world in general, it's something that happens every day. You know, people immigrate for different reasons, but if you call yourself an immigrant, automatically negative attributes are associated to you, and assumptions are they're added to you.
If I go to Mexico, the people I most identify myself with, they'll still see me as an American. Like, I'm not entirely accepted. And over here, though, I'm always be a Mexican, although I was born here.
It's just a lot sometimes, especially since I'm the oldest in my family, and since my mom was the first one to move to the United States, I'm the first child to go to college in the United States. But it can get stressful sometimes.
Yeah, I like to, say that I'm Asian American because if no one really knows about Indonesian Americans. I mean, I like to say that I'm Asian American, and that has helped me form bonds with other Asian Americans as well.
Hello, this is Roslyn Hernández.
And this is Giovanny Panginda.
We're back.
We are.
We're back for another great conversation with another amazing guest here on the FYI on Youth Ministry, a podcast by the Fuller Youth Institute. Today's guest is Kevin Wilson, whom you might know from social media as Cross Culture Christian. Kevin is the digital and social media coordinator at Andrews University. He was a youth and young adult pastor at SDA Oceanside, California. Kevin was born in Sri Lanka and moved to the Sultanate of Oman when he was 12 and has lived in Maryland, Lebanon, Michigan, and California. And Chai has been a companion for Kevin through all of his adventures, and we are so excited that Kevin is our companion for this conversation today. Kevin, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity, Roslyn and Giovanni. I really appreciate you having me on this podcast. I've been following Fuller for a while now, and so when Roslyn reached out to me with this invitation, I was like, oh my goodness, this is exciting. So really appreciate the opportunity to just chop it up with you guys.
Kevin, you were in Sri Lanka not long ago recently. What was one of the things that you're still thinking about from your trip?
The reason why I went to Sri Lanka, the main reason, it was to dedicate my nephew. And so it's 7 months. I haven't seen my nephew, and so my sister was waiting for me to come and do the pastoral dedication for him. And so that was a real honor for me. So I'm still thinking about Zion, my nephew.
That's so great. Kevin, you come to this conversation with this personal experience of immigration, but you also work with youth and young adults in the U.S. for some time now, right? So you have also learned from some of your students stories of immigration and migration. What are some of the migration and immigration realities or stories you have experienced or heard of?
So, a lot of people use the term migration and immigration interchangeably, and I see why they do that. But I think there are some key differences between the two. I think migration, for the most part, refers to the movement of individuals or a group of individuals from one region to another within the same geographical landscape within a country. So they will probably move from one state to another, maybe, or one province to another. Immigrations, is often permanent, while migration doesn't always have to be. So I grew up in Sri Lanka. I was born in Sri Lanka. I lived there till I was 12 years old. Then I moved to the Middle East, the Sultanate of Oman, lived there for about 6 years. Then I came to the States when I was 18. So by the time I turned 18 or 19, my consciousness about my culture, my consciousness about the world is is somewhat markedly different from someone, say, who's lived their life in the United States up until they were 18. And so that move was the first time I would leave my country, leave my family and my comfort zone for an extended period of time. So that was a pretty traumatic experience, but it was also looking back, it's definitely an experience that I think has made me into the person I am today. Definitely a significant part of my life.
Wow. I can empathize with your situation just because I immigrated to the United States when I was 4 years old. And I remember experiencing some of the traumas of just being in another country, and especially at such a young age, trying to like fit in, trying to learn a new language, trying to understand the cultural nuances that America has versus what Indonesia has. But in your experience, can you tell us what are like a couple of the most important things that you learned about immigration, especially when it comes to ministering to young people? Because I grew up, I didn't have a youth pastor growing up. And so navigating the waters, I wish I had more, I guess, older figures to help look out or to help me, with immigration. And how about you? Like, what have you learned about immigration when it comes to ministering to young people?
So I think one thing that youth pastors, youth ministers, and just leaders in general, particularly, have to remember is that these kids, these people have lived through some tough experiences, and also, and because of that, they may not always want to be upfront and give to a community. Sometimes these things take time and they take trust. Because from the immigrant perspective, when you come to a new place, your highest priority becomes survival. It's not necessarily performance, it's survival. And so you're going to do everything possible to survive. And if survival means that you're going to, especially when it comes to church events and church youth groups and things like that, extroversion is often considered like a fruit of the spirit, right? They would they would ask, so the people who are more outside and people who are more overt and vocal, they're considered like the leaders. And if you have that metric of choosing leaders, then you're going to, for sure, sideline and marginalize the immigrants who are there, because they're not going to be upfront and they're going to be vocal, up at least at first. It's going to take some time for them. And so be patient with them. Be understanding of their experience. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that a broken English accent often reveals an unbroken resolve to survive. So just because they can't speak proper English, that should direct anybody who's listening to say they speak another language. They're navigating another experience. They are they're learning to adapt to a new situation. So it's so tempting to use the success metrics that we are used to now gauge the effectiveness of your ministry and the response of these students. But you have to prioritize listening and understanding and journeying with these students. And and you have to play the long game. You have to play the long game with the immigrants if you really want the best out of them. Because once you have their trust, they are going to be some of the best workers for you. They're going to be the best leaders. They're going to be the best people who are going to perform. And that's been my experience.
I love that you said all that, because you really spoke to my 4-year-old heart. Really, those are some of the things that I wish people around me knew about me and about immigrants. And I think I would have had less trauma growing up had people known about that, especially like what you said about language. I grew up almost ashamed of my language, so I actually tried my best to get rid of it, and I practiced my best to get rid of my Indonesian accent but it comes out when I'm angry. but I tried my best to be more quote unquote American, so that I could be American, so I could fit in with other people. So much so that I feel so disappointed in myself in the way I treated my parents, especially in the way they were trying to learn English, and kind of me resenting them and like wishing, Mom, can you also try to get rid of your accent? Dad, can you actually say, can you not roll your R's? Can you enunciate? Can you do this? Um, Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and I think that another aspect of this is like some of us immigrate or immigrate to the United States and we're first generation. And then some of us are like second generation, you know, or like 1.5 generation, which is my case. I was born here in California, but moved to Mexico and then came back when I was 8 years old. So that's like a very much like complicated way of being part of the United States. And that aspect of my parents, you know, they still don't speak English as the way that, you know, other immigrant families come and assimilate more, or, you know, just learn more of the language. And so sometimes people come and immigrate to places in the United States where there's a large population of the community where they come from. And so sometimes there's no need for them to necessarily learn English or to adapt as much, because part of their community of what they have known their whole life is it's here. And but that also means that there's a lot of like history, right? Because you spoke of like sometimes there's like the difference in culture that happens, and sometimes there's like generational trauma because of the reasons that people had to leave their country. There are asylum seekers that are immigrants that, you know, it's so painful for them to have to leave because of violence or because of economic reasons or any other things like that, that those are also reasons why they might not be so forthcoming in talking about the immigration story that their families carry. And so it's really important, as you said, Kevin, for us to be really intentional about being hospitable and making a safe space of belonging for people that are new to our congregations, for people that we know have immigration stories. That sometimes I'm in my 30s, I'm still like working through things of generational trauma that my family has, not just because of immigration, but because of other things that are linked to that. Is the intersectionality and the complexity of our stories that that when we create a space of safety, when we create those kinds of spaces, we can really not just make people comfortable, but become more familial with the students that we work with and with their families, making the space for their families, for them to also feel comfortable and to feel like they become a part of the church or the ministry when we are hospitable and open for them to join as they come and as they are and with everything that they bring. So one of the things that we have been talking about this season is how we foster belonging and how we practice hospitality with our students. So when we think about diversity, especially for Gen Z, right? Many of their families have stories of immigration. So what can we do to acknowledge and honor our students? What can we do to honor their stories, to create multicultural or cross-cultural spaces where our students can feel belonging?
I mean, you guys are already doing it. This is the first time, honestly, this is the first time I've been asked to speak to the migration experience from a theological context. And that's both simultaneously awesome, but also kind of sad, right? In a global world, in a diverse world, like we should be talking about this. In addition to that, I think there's some things that we all can do, and these are not like rocket science. These are all relational things. Learning and pronouncing their names correctly is huge. There are people from different cultures who don't want to say their names out loud because it's just too complicated, or the last names that it's just too much, and they won't say it out loud. But then if you go that extra mile to be like, hey, how do you say it, and then learning how to say it, learning how to pronounce it. Sometimes I'll ask students when they have these interesting last names, I was like, how do you pronounce it? And I try to say it back. They're like, whoa, they're like eyes like lighten up, and something clicks because they didn't expect somebody to say it like that. And so names are attached to people's identities. They're not just identifiers of people or labels. Oftentimes names signify heritage, ancestry, culture, stories. They're a distillation of stories. So honoring and learning just to memorize, learning how to pronounce names is like basic fundamental practice for everybody, I would say. At a congregation level, I mean, I would say look at your leadership team. Are the immigrants in your congregation represented there in your leadership? Who in the places of power, the people who are your deacons, your elders, your pastors, your pastoral team, your worship leaders. Does what's happening on stage, does it reflect what's happening outside of the stage? That's something to keep in mind, because representation is huge. When I came to Andrews University, I was a Sri Lankan kid in a Sri Lankan theology major in a pretty homogenous class, and I was just trying my best to just trying to fit into existing molds. And the story that I told myself was that everything, that my past was a liability and not an asset. And if that changed when I actually met Dr. Kulasekara, who's a Sri Lankan retired educator in the community, who also came to the States when he was 18, but now he's in his 70s. But when I saw him, and when I saw him interact with other people, that was for me excellence in my skin, right? And so that was huge for me as a Sri Lankan man trying to figure out who I was and who I was in Christ. He was also a Christian, a deeply godly man, and he just became everything that I wanted to be, and so much more. And then on a deeper level, probably kind of a long-term strategy is to kind of revisit your worship and liturgy. Like, how are we incorporating the languages and the cultures of your diverse congregation? What would it look like, for example, to develop a theology of worship that is not just like biblically faithful, but also culturally sensitive? Most of what we are teaching from the pulpits and our theology classes, they tend to be quite Eurocentric. And I'm sure there's more, but those are the things that come to my mind as you're thinking about creating cross-cultural spaces in our communities.
As congregations and as leaders, our self-awareness also has to take part in that, and like our own anti-racism work. And so that's something that we've talked about in other episodes of the podcast, but sometimes exposure is something that we need. And so just learning more about other cultures not just within our community, but just about other cultures around the world is really important. And knowing our own immigration story. In the United States, there are a lot of European Americans who don't know their immigration story, whether it was when, the United States was, or what is now known as the United States, was first colonized by English colonizers, whatever it was, or if it's a migration from Italy or from other places in Europe, nobody here was already here when this land was not, before it was colonized, except for native indigenous peoples. And so I think something that is really honoring even to ourselves and our history is to know about the history of our people, of our family, because whiteness is not an ethnicity, and so we all have ethnicity, even if we come from what has now become known a white race. We all have ethnic backgrounds, and we should all be aware of them and proud of them. And as you said, like knowing about the cultures that we come from, it just makes what we already have in Christianity a lot more rich for us and for the people that come to our communities.
I related to everything that you both said, especially since I myself here in America, I go to an Indonesian American church. But what I tend to forget is actually I go to a Chinese Indonesian American church, and like half of our congregants are Chinese Indonesians. It wasn't until recently that kind of like what you said here, that we started incorporating Chinese worship songs into our liturgy, into our worship services, just because of that's a part of our culture that we tend to sadly not talk about, or tend to deny, or tend to take a back seat because we tend to put Indonesian American as the primary. But so I love that you both talked about that, because I really do see these changes even in my own church. And like another aspect of young people's immigration realities particularly for young adults, is a movement towards reconnecting, right? Or connecting more deeply with their cultural roots. How have you seen students reconnecting with their cultural roots, and how can we, as leaders and as a church, how can we respond and support our students through this process of reconnecting?
The first thing that comes to my mind is this quote from the African continent. It goes like this: it says, the fish knows the beauty of water once it's outside of it. And essentially, I think the context behind that quote is to suggest that once you leave your comfort zones, it's usually those moments become clarifying moments for you. Those moments actually become transformative moments for you, because you're now in kind of this liminal space where you're trying to figure out, okay, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I'm not where I need to be. I'm here. Who am I? And so that was my experience as an immigrant. I was as an 18-year-old kid and going through my first couple of years in the United States. And so I got to know my Sri Lankanness, my Middle Easternness, my Adventism, my Christianity, my Tamilness, my languageness when I left them, in a sense. And I also got to know, and in that process, I learned from that experience that I had to now grapple with things that were troublesome about my heritage and things that were beautiful about my heritage. And so sensitizing immigrants and third culture kids, people who have left their countries, to, I would say, normalizing this experience as an experience of clarification and transformation is going to be very key for ministry leaders in the church. So to be able to have, say, people who have gone through that experience before, to actually share from their experience, it's like, hey, I went through that too, man. And just to journey alongside with them is gonna help kids to see their experience as not a bad thing or a negative thing, but a growing thing. So you don't demonize that experience. You can actually take that experience and give it to God and say, hey, God, what are you trying to do in this situation, in this season in my life? So that's going to come with sensitizing to the fact that this is a growing experience, and number two, also having somebody journeys alongside with them who's gone through that similar experience. For me, also, making and drinking chai, it was a way of connecting with my roots, and because I missed home, I missed my mom, I missed my dad, and so making chai for me was a deeply theological practice. It was, and for many of us in the South Asian diaspora, food and drinks are not fuel for us. These are sacraments of love. These are things that we use. We use to connect to our ancestry, our heritage, and also our spirituality. And so that's what chai became for me. And so when it comes to ministry to the immigrant, the immigrant brother, sister, friend, I would say like intentional hospitality oftentimes is more effective in building trust than some sort of like impressive theology. When we bring in food, when we bring in different groups of people and serve together, and we share experiences, those things can become powerful experiences where people can get to connect to their roots.
I love that. So a lot of people, often think Christianity is like this Western religion, right? When the reality is it's actually Eastern, right? And so one of my white friends said that when he started hanging out with me and my family, it helped him understand the Bible a bit better. And I was totally confused by that, because how is it? How does that enhance your experience when we're not Jewish, right? I'm Indonesian, and he's like, well, I think the aspect that I was missing, in the Bible is the communal sense, because him growing up, as a white American and living in a very individualistic kind of mindset, and then having friends kind of like me who come from more collectivistic, communal kind of setting, and really when it comes to dinner table or that kind of fellowship, or just like when you say, or in my language, like like aunties and uncles, like everyone's your auntie and uncle kind of thing. Which kind of confused my white friend, like how so that familial spirit, that's familial aspect that that God often talks about and Christ talks about, how who is my family, right? Who is my mother and brother? Those that do what I do, and so it helped him actually experience the communal aspect of Christ, and I love that because kind of like we said earlier, I used to think that my past was my liability, when the reality is it's not just my strength, but it also can help not just enhance me, but it can help enhance others. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
When you said that, bro, like I'm reminded of this Revelation 3:20, which says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone invites me, and I'll come home, I'll eat with him, and I'll make my home with him." If you look at that from a South Asian lens, or a Southeast Asian lens, or even a Latinx lens, you understand what he's trying to say. Like, because in these cultures, and I can speak about just the Middle Eastern, the Bedouin experience. So the Bedouins are nomads in Oman and in Saudi Arabia and parts of the world. They are desert dwellers, right? So when a fellow Bedouin walks into another Bedouin's tent, first of all, one Bedouin is obligated to offer hospitality to a fellow traveler. And once they come and they eat together, they shake their hands, and they do some sort of a ritual whereby they know that because they have ate together, because they have had a meal together, the person who was offered the hospitality is now basically saying, because I've given food to you, I'm also going to give my life for you whenever that time comes. So, and it's that same energy and same sentiment that's shared when a group of us Sri Lankans or Indians come together and we have chai together, because chai is at the nexus of all these different things that's happening in our culture. And so when we share a drink together, it's like, no, we're sharing our lives together. And so yeah, these kind of elements, the Bible is a deeply human cultural book, and to just look at it from this kind of one lens is such a gross disservice to both the Bible and to our growth in Christ. And so we definitely need the immigrant experience and all these different perspectives to help enhance our understanding of Scripture and theology.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah. By now, anyone listening will know that at the end of the episode, we are ending with a practice that we're calling language to swap. And that's a practice that we have in the guide Talking About Race with Teenagers that Kat Armas, Jennifer Guerra-Aldana, and Aaron Martinez invited us to be intentional about. And we're being intentional with our words, right? As we talk with people of color who are our students or the people that we're doing ministry with. So what phrase do you hope would change, or what phrase have you changed when it comes to talking about immigration, Kevin?
So one of my friends is a pastor in a place in California, and they have a pretty diverse population. And they used to, about 30 years ago, they used to have a lot of refugees coming in. And this church became a haven for refugees. But they had a name for this initiative that they still haven't changed. And my pastor was a friend. He's like, man, I'm just trying to change this name because it is definitely not what we're trying to do. I think they called it the Refugee Assimilation Project.
Oh, okay.
And he's like, bro, this is not it, bro. And so yeah, so if there's one word that I wish we would not, we would say less of, and we'd probably not even use it, is the word assimilation when it comes to the immigrant experience. They're not supposed to be assimilating. That's not the point of that. I think maybe what they're doing is they're adapting, right? They're adapting to new circumstances, adapting to new situations that they're finding themselves in. And assimilation for me when I say that, when I think about that, it means that you are dissolving your individuality and your unique particularities in order to fit into existing molds that were determined by existing power structures and that were designed for certain intent or goal. Adaptation, I would say, probably, I don't know if it's like the best alternative, but it could be an alternative to that word, where he's basically saying, you know what, they're not trying to assimilate, they're adapting, and they are also, you know, learning more about themselves, and they are becoming more and more of who they were meant to be during this experience.
Ooh, that's a heavy one. um, I think we should, stop repeating negative stereotypes. I think negative stereotypes can often lead to repeating misinformation about, a specific ethnic group. If we are Christians and we're supposed to be truth tellers and truth seekers, let's not repeat negative stereotypes about people. My hope is that we emphasize our shared humanity, that immigrants are part of us. Immigrants are our friends. They're our colleagues. They're our family members. They're our neighbors. But, so oftentimes we hear of, like other ideas, like they are our enemies. And I think there's a guy named Jesus who said something about loving our neighbors. I think that's in the Bible somewhere. Yeah. So something like that, Roslyn. Yeah.
Thanks for that. There's I can't remember where he says this, but Richard Rohr has a saying that has really stayed with me, and it was something like, don't, like, in order to correct someone or to show someone a better way, you don't have to tell them like, that is wrong, this is a better way. Like, you can just do the thing that you think is better, right? And so, like, whenever we're correcting like either stereotypes or we're just talking about people of color or people who are immigrants, we don't have to say like the stereotype, or we don't have to say the things that people have said in the past. We can just start our practice of like honoring people for who they are and not having to like talk about any of the past whenever it's possible. Yeah. For me, this is something that it kind of bothers me, honestly. Whenever we mean to say the name of this country, when people use America to say that, like, this is America, this is the United States, and the United States is in the continent of America, but Canada is also America. Mexico and other countries in this continent are also America. And so Mexicans are Americans. Like, even without having to immigrate to the United States, they are Americans. And so that's something that I think, is something that comes from like a very colonized way of thinking that has been pervasive in like schooling in the United States, that that we think this piece of land that has been colonized, that has become this country, is all there is to this continent, or that we own this continent somehow. Like, I don't know, you might have even caught it that I'm like trying to like correct myself as I talk, because it's something that, even though it's something I'm conscious of, it's been so ingrained in my mind because I was raised in the United States education system. That's what would be the change for me, that we are more intentional about how we talk about this country, and we call it what the country is called instead of what the whole continent, which a lot of other people belong to and live on. So, Kevin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah,
this was such a
thank you
great
so
conversation.
much.
I wish we had so much more time.
Yeah. And a cup of masala chai that was made by you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. Really appreciate both of you, and for sharing your experiences with me as well. Every time I talk about this experience, it's kind of like, it's really good, at least for me, to just remember who I am, remember my roots. Filipino proverb: you can't go where you need to go unless you know where you came from. And so the importance of knowing roots, the importance of knowing your identity, it's so key. So thank you for creating a space for us to discuss those realities.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, listeners.
Hasta luego.
Sampai ketemu lagi.
Bye.
If you want to read more about the original language to swap ideas, you can actually find them in the Ministry Toolkit Talking About Race with Teenagers. It's linked in our show notes. You can find us, the Fuller Youth Institute, on social media for more content and videos and to stay up to date on all the latest research we're doing. Thanks so much for listening. And finally, here is one final thought from a young person.
If somebody is proud of their identity, let them be proud of their identity. Their race isn't something you need to focus on. Just say, this is my friend. This is somebody that I care about and somebody I respect.